This podcast is for the short story, The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. I don't think this story is terribly difficult, but there might be a few points where you miss something that is important. In the first couple of paragraphs, it's established, as we read in class, that there's a horrible plague and that Prince Prospero seeks to avoid it by basically taking a lot of the upper class people and they weld the bolts to the gate of this abbey that he owns, and they're going to hide there and essentially party while everybody else can deal with the problem here on the outsides. So they show really no kind of concern for the average man and only about themselves. And it's a masquerade, which means that people are dressed up. And then Poe goes through a pretty long description of the setting. I would read it carefully, but at the same time, it's more of a matter of creating an atmosphere that fits the Gothic story. And he describes all of the different rooms and the Gothic window, and in particular, of course, the last room, which is completely black and red. The symbolism is pretty obvious there. And if you go to page 3, though, section 3, the part that starts with same material and hue, and you look at the second paragraph there, the one that begins, "It was in that apartment." There's this description of this clock, this giant black ebony clock, and how the people would listen to the music and party and have a great time. And then when this clock would strike every hour, everybody would stop, their faces would grow pale, and they would seem to be extremely disturbed. They'd look at each other nervously and so on. And symbolism-wise, a lot of people look at this as being, when we hear about death, when we hear a story that's horrible, when we have to go to a funeral, whatever, when we have to deal with death, we're shocked, but then we go right back to our daily lives and try to avoid talking about it as much as possible. And when we turn all the way to page 6, when this masked figure arrives dressed as somebody who has this plague, and this is described on page 6 in the second paragraph there, it says that the figure was tall and gaunt and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave, and that he basically has blood on his face, just like the Red Death. And that is why people were so horrified and why Prospero is so angry. How dare you bring that up? I mean, I even kind of noticed in class when talking about this short story or talking about death in general that a lot of students kind of roll their eyes and, just we don't want to face it. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to deal with it, and we'd rather just ignore it. And yet it's something that is inevitable that everyone will face at one point, and that maybe by dealing with it and talking about it a little bit more, it'll make it easier to deal with when the time comes. But we don't. And so Prince Prospero is angry, and at the end, of course, he follows this masked figure through all of the rooms, which could be seen as stages of life or a lot of other symbolism in those kinds of colors, and finally to the end, where it is found out that it's not necessarily a person. Instead, it is a figure who's symbolic of the Red Death, that somehow it had gotten into the party, and then one by one, everybody dies. Thanks for listening.